Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation. This time we're going over a little bit of bonus material for Build Week. I'm going to be talking about how to generate API documentation using apiDoc. Um, so there's an enormous number of ways to write documentation for your API, and it's important that you find one that you like because without documentation, frankly, your API is useless. Um, and that's kind of magnified by build weeks because in a lot of cases, well, someone could go and read your source code and figure out what your API does, but we're on cross-functional teams here. Our front-end developers don't know how to read our Node and Express API code, and nor should that be a requirement for anyone who wants to figure out how to interact with our API. Right? When we used any of the public-facing APIs in our previous projects, we never had to look at source code. We just inspected their API documentation. So your documentation is really, without it, like your API is useless. People are unable to use it, and what good is an API if it's difficult for people to figure out how to use? So a basic approach is you can document all the endpoints and what they need and what they give back in Markdown inside the README of your backend repo, and that's totally fine. I don't want to disparage that at all. I just want to give you a little bit of insight into additional systems that exist. We also have other tools like Insomnia and Postman allow us to add documentation to the requests that we're making. And Postman will even go so far as providing you like real-time hosting of that documentation, and you can share links to it, and that's all very good. I'm not going to be going over that here. I want to go over a package called apiDoc. And what this allows us to do is write our documentation as comments directly inside of our source code. And I like a system like this because it keeps our code and our documentation close together. So it's much harder for me to update one of my endpoints and then forget to update the documentation for that, as I can see those side by side. There are drawbacks to it, however. It's going to make our files a lot longer because oftentimes documentation for an endpoint will be very long and the actual code in the endpoint is very short. So there's trade-offs. Please play around with it, experiment, see what you like, and we're going to get started. So first we have to add apiDocs as a dependency, and it's very easy. If I can remember the package name that we have here, which is going to be apiDoc, yes. And we should actually probably install this as a dev dependency because we're only going to use it, but it doesn't really matter. So we've added that dependency, and now we can use it. Like Next, like Create React App, this is a package that we actually want to run in order to provide us output. And we can do that by doing npx apiDoc and then giving it input as to the kind of documentation we want it to generate. That's not very useful to do until we write some documentation. So let's take a look at that. The way we handle this is we go into a file where we have an endpoint that we want to document. So I'm going to go into my owners directory, and I'm going to take a look at my owners router. This is the project that we did involving owners having pets and all of that. So I want to document this owners endpoint. And what I do is I write a comment right here, and it's going to be a multi-line comment. So we're just going to open up a nice multi-line comment environment for this. And there's a specific syntax that we use within these comments that apiDoc will find and will parse and will use to generate a nice page of documentation for us. And that's going to look like what you see here. So obviously apiDocs has pretty nice documentation. Otherwise, I wouldn't consider endorsing said product. And so inside of this comment block, we have these various parameters that we specify with the @ symbol and then the parameter name, and then we give them certain values. So this first line here is I'm saying that this is going to be an API endpoint. It is going to be a GET request, And then I'm going to describe the path, which is going to be, did I have this prefixed by API? I did not. So this is going to be at owners. Owners. And then I can say get owners information. I can also specify the API version that our API is. We don't really get into that at build weeks because we're really just trying to build version 1.0 or perhaps even less than that. But another important part of your documentation is oftentimes you can't just update your API. You need to provide a way to have old users be able to access the API that they built their code around, and have new users be able to access the updated versions. So we're not going to do that here though. The name of this is going to be get owners, and then we can also specify the group of other requests that we want this to show up with. So usually that is our resource name, so I'm going to call that owners. Now we can also, you know what, this is enough. Let's go ahead and generate this and see what this looks like. So now we're going to use our apiDoc command. So I'm going to do npx apiDoc, and then we have to give it some input. We have to tell it where to search for files, which if we have all of our routes located in their own directory, we can very easily do something like /routes. In this case, we have our routes kind of scattered around in their own directories for that resource. So I can just specify my current directory. In that case, I can add the flag -e and tell it to exclude a directory. So I don't want apiDocs to look through node modules, which is a generally decent idea. And then I would like to specify the output directory, which I'd like that to be in /docs. And we run our command, and we get some messages. So let's take a look at the output. So we don't see anything yet. It's gotten mad at me. The first thing it says is create an apiDoc JSON configuration. Notice how this says level of worn. We'll talk about creating that file, but you don't technically need one in order for the project to work. It's also said there's nothing to do. So I think it has not found the file that we put this in. Let me make sure the formatting here matches. Oh, yeah, I think I was missing this double star here. Let's see if... There we go. So now it's generated the documentation. So if we look at the root of our repository, we now see we have this directory called docs. And it's got a whole bunch of stuff in here, but ultimately what this is a static set of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open that in my web browser. And I'm going to do a little command line magic that you may not know you're able to do. And there we go. We get this nice looking page of documentation, and we can see we have this group of endpoints under owners. We have our get owners information endpoint. It's also pulled some information out of our package.json, and you can notice this is the old WebDB3 recitation project that I'm using. And it has information about this request. It's a GET request. We're hitting this endpoint. Now let's add some more stuff to this so that it looks a bit more interesting. So I'm going to go into owners, and we're going to check out the owners router, and we're going to add some more bits of information. So we can specify the different parameters that users send upon this request. So since it's a GET request, we don't have anything, but we can also specify parameters that the user will receive on success. So in this case, actually, I'm going to write this for the specific owners endpoint just so we can get an example of these parameters. So I'm going to bring this down here, and look at how easy this is. It's a piece of, you know, it's part of my source code just like anything else, so I can edit it just like anything else. So I'm going to make this /owners/:ID. I'm going to say get owner. That's what this endpoint is going to be called, and we'll call it get owner. And now I'm going to specify the API parameter that we need. It's going to be a number, which we write inside of the curly braces after the API param. It is of type number. Its name is going to be the next piece of information there, so that's an ID, and then the rest of this line is the description. I'm just going to say user ID. And if you look at the docs, we can slide on down to API param to view everything that we can do here. So optionally, we can specify a group, we have a type, we have a default value, it's also optional, and then a description. And we can do lots of cool things with the formatting in there, but let's look at our example here. So we have the parameter. They have to have the ID as part of their URL, and we can also use this to specify body parameters as well. And on success, we can look at what we expect the output to be when we get an owner. They're going to get an ID, a name, an email, and an array of pets. So what we would do here is we would again specify the types of these different fields. So we'd have ID, that would be a number, it would be called ID, and it would be the user ID. And I'm just going to copy and paste these. We're also going to get a string, and that is going to be the name, and that is going to be the owner name, and this should be owner ID instead of user ID. It's probably driving some of you crazy. We're also going to have the email. That's their email. And then we're going to have the interesting piece of data, which is going to be this array of pets objects. So the way we would describe this is it would be pets, and it would be array of pets objects belonging to owner. What we can do is when we have a type that is a set of something inside of an array, we specify the type, and then we put these square brackets at the end. And the reason is because if we put the square brackets around here, then apiDocs is going to treat this as an optional thing. Whereas this syntax says that we have an array of objects. And I don't have to stick to pre-written types. I could just call this an array of pets if I wanted to. It's ultimately just going to be text, but we'll have it be like that. So now I want to go and check my documentation, and it's the same. It's because whenever we update our documentation, we need to rerun this command. And boy, I don't feel like typing this out every time. Luckily, it was the last command that I wrote, so I can just hit up inside of my terminal to get it. But wouldn't it be nice if we had some way of saving this command and being able to rerun it with a name that we have chosen? We can put it in our package.json. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to add a new entry under scripts, I'm going to call it docs, and then I'm going to paste that command in there. So we're getting the input from our root directory, we're excluding node modules, and we're outputting into the docs directory. So now in my terminal, instead of writing all of that, I can just say yarn docs. And there we go. Our documentation has been updated, and we now get some nice information out here. So they need the ID, and that's going to be the owner ID, and they're going to get all this information. Right, and we can see this ended up just being text. We can really do whatever we want with that type. One of the other very cool things is we can include what a successful response looks like. So in here, I'm going to go and add a new line, and this is going to be API success example. And then we can call this whatever we want, successful response. And then we get to give the returned response. So we're going to get a 200 here in the case that this is successful. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in. And then I want to give an example back. So I can just go into Insomnia. I can just copy this. You could also write your own example if you wanted to, but we already have seed data. You could also go copy it from there, but this is easiest. I'm sure there's a way to do this with multiple cursors inside of VS Code that's going to make this easy, but I'm just going to go down the line here, and for each one of these lines, I am going to put a space in front of it, and then a star, and then another space, and there we go. And this ended up a little further right than it should be. So now I can regenerate my documentation, and when we go and check it out, we see we get this syntax highlighted response of our JSON. And it's very cool. And it's very cool. We can do this with post requests as well. We can do this with any type of request. So let's go ahead and write this real quickly for adding an owner. So let me find the post here in my document. So that's going to be right here. I just copy and pasted the kind of preamble from the previous apiDoc block. Instead of this being a get, this is going to be a post request. We're not going to make a request to :id. We are going to add an owner instead. The name of this is going to be add owner, and this is still going to be in the owners group. We're going to need some additional parameters though, not an ID. We're going to need a string that is the owner's name, and we're also going to need another string that is the owner's email. You can also add other information in here, like not unique, must be unique. Make our API just a little bit easier to use. And now we can also specify what an example request should look like. So that's going to be under API param example. So what we'll do here, as in the same way that we did an API success example, I'm going to make a row that is API param example, and we will do the name of this. So this is going to be I don't know. I'm going to call this example body, and then that should be a colon, and then we'll do the same thing with our JSON. So I can just pop into Postman, and I can post owner, and it's going to be Freddie Mercury. I'm going to paste that in, and then I actually want to decrease the indentation on that, so I'm going to do that. And then for each one of these lines, just get it formatted nicely. And now, when we regenerate our documentation, we'll find that we now have two endpoints documented, our add owner's endpoint and our get owner. And we can see that we now have the parameters here, name and email. This is the example of what the request should look like. And in the response back, we are going to get the same thing. The ID, the name, the email, and then an array of pets objects. If you look in the documentation, there's also ways of defining things that you can reuse, so that we could define a block so that we could reuse this example response. Because in this case we should expect slightly different things when we add an owner. We should be getting an empty pets array. We might want to document that instead. So we would just add another block that's at API success example, and then go ahead and paste that in. Pardon me. There we go. Do our formatting magic. Regenerate our docs. And there we go. And I forgot to name this thing, so I'm going to do that. Regen the docs. We can also specify failures. So we might have an API that can fail in various ways. So we have API errors. So, for example, we can have an error for when the user is not found. And we can also give an example of what that will look like. So I might want to document the errors in the case where the email is already taken, or in the GET request where we have a 404 because the owner we're trying to get doesn't exist. So let's do that for the GET owner. So what we're going to do is we have our GET owner docs here, and now I am going to add some more lines. Oop. And what we're going to do is we're going to have at API error, and I prefer looking at the examples they have compared to the documentation because it's just a bit easier for me to fill in the blanks. So we want to call this user not found. The ID of the user owner was not found. So again, we have a name here, which should be owner not found. And then we also have a description of the error. And then, same as our other types of things, we have API error example. And we have to provide the name for this. And this is going to be error response. Really doesn't matter what we call these examples too much. And in this case, we're going to have, I'm not sure I have my server running. So I'm going to start that up real fast. And we can write out our own example. We know what it should be if we're writing this code, but we can also force this error and just make sure we get an accurate response. And didn't like this for some reason, probably because I did some weird copy and pasting of stuff, but we'll just write our own. So instead of this being an HTTP status of 200, this is going to be a 404, and we can look up what that should actually be. So let's look at our HTTP status codes. I think it's not found. Yes. Not found. And then we'll describe what the response is going to look like. It's going to be some object that has an error message in it. It says user with owner with ID not found. And there we go. Regenerate our docs. Let's take a look at them. And now for this, we have both our success case, an example of it, and then the error where the owner is not found. So, very pretty documentation, not that much work. And this also gets checked into source code with us. So we're in this interesting situation of the fact that, actually before I move on, do we have any questions about this?
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, you install the API doc, the package.json, but when you're running the command, you're saying npx API doc. So why are you running it with npx?
Because I have it installed locally for this project, the same way we would do npx next.
Oh, because you have to have it installed globally for the command to run?
Yeah, you could install it globally and then use it that way. I prefer to use the npx version because that's going to run the version of API docs that I have installed locally, and that'll prevent some versioning issues if the one I have installed differs from the one I have installed globally. So npx will let us...
Yeah, go ahead.
No, npx lets us run the packages we have installed in node modules. So I'm running the version that I have installed right now. Did you have
okay. Yeah, so can we go over that command again? Like, I didn't follow the flag.
Okay. So I have it saved in my package.json. When we're inside of our scripts here, we don't have to specify npx because it will automatically add our node modules folder to the path. So we invoke API doc, and then -i is going to be our input directory. So it's going to be our current directory, right? This is going to be the root of our directory when we run the command. I want to exclude node modules. I don't want node modules to be parsed for files that contain API documentation because it's not going to be mine. This would also slow down the API generation significantly because node modules gets real big. And then I want to specify the output folder, which is going to be in docs. And you can call this whatever you want. We can add another flag here to slightly speed up searching times. I can say I only want to search for files with a type of JavaScript. I don't have to do that. But by default, apiDocs works for a bunch of different languages. So it will go ahead and look for, CoffeeScript, Elixir, Python files as well that also contain these comment blocks.
Okay, so what about you don't have to import the library in the file that you're trying to run the
Nope.
API docs on?
It's because the way that this works is what we write here, these documentation strings, these are comments. This is just a normal JavaScript comment, but it's formatted such that API docs, when it looks through that file, will see it, will parse it, and will generate our documentation from it. So we don't actually need it as an imported dependency anywhere because we're not doing anything with functions that it exports. We're just running it as a command wholesale. So similarly to we do with like NodeMon. NodeMon does this exterior thing to our files that we like. We don't need to import it anywhere. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm just like fascinated by this tool. It's just like really cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. And there's tons of things like this out there. I would encourage you to look around. One of the things for this build week on Backend is, there's this thing where like, oh, you build this nice, beautiful backend. And what actually gets demoed is the front end. And if you want to put this on a portfolio piece, on your resume or on your website, then you link to the front end. And maybe you're not happy with how that turned out, or, maybe you don't feel like that shows off everything you did. Something that you can link to is this documentation and be like, look at this perfect, beautiful, well-specified documentation for my entire API. Ooh. One of the backend developers that I had in one of my build weeks got hired, largely because of the quality of his documentation on our build week project. So, write good docs. Write good docs. You all know at this point, good docs are hard to come by. So, do a good job. If you have time, of course. So we now have this interesting dilemma of I can view this file locally, right? Because it's a static index.html. But we also have the convenience of the fact that everything that I am writing is hooked into my source code because it's a comment inside of it. And so that's under my version control. And so if I want to deploy that, I could do a couple different things. One is that I could generate this documentation and host it on Netlify, and that would certainly work, but it's going to be very easy for that to get out of sync, or I guess that wouldn't because it would automatically redeploy. So that's an option that you could use. But we kind of already have all this stuff deployed on Heroku. So what we could do is when I do a git status here, let me bump this up a bit, we'll now see that I can add docs to my source control. So I could do that, but that's something that we generally want to avoid because we don't want to include build artifacts into our version control. And so what do I mean by build artifacts? What I mean by that is stuff that we generate by running commands. So we don't want to include SQLite databases in our source control because they're not source code. They're things that it's something that's generated from source code. Same thing when we use CSS preprocessors like Less and Sass. We generally don't want to check in the generated CSS from those. We want our build scripts to run the Less compiler or the Sass compiler in order to generate that, so they don't get out of sync here. So what we can do is we can, when we deploy to Heroku, in the same way that we run our next commands with Heroku run, we can run our API docs generation commands, which we thankfully have saved within our package.json scripts. But now we have this difficulty of we have them up on Heroku, we have them up to date, but how do we show them to the user? Well, the answer is that Express can host static files. It doesn't have to do our fancy endpoint middleware stuff. It's a server, and servers serve static files frequently. So what we would do is we would go into our index.js or server.js, and we would set up a new endpoint. And I'm going to have this be /docs, and then we need to serve our static directory. And the way we do this is by referencing my old code so that I say the right thing. Yep. So unfortunately, we can't do something quite as simple as doing like /docs here. We just have to wrap this in a call to express.static. And now that will serve the contents of the docs directory on the endpoint docs. So let's see. Let's get our server running. And then let's go to localhost 5000 docs. And there we go. That's our documentation being served up by our server. So we could very easily deploy this to Heroku. Once the deploy is done, we could run our yarn docs command on there. And then boom, we have up-to-date docs at the same URL as the actual API. And then, because we can build our docs on demand, we don't want to include this docs directory inside of our source control. So what we're going to do is we are going to find our .getignore file, and then anywhere we want to, I'm going to add a little comment here. I'm going to exclude the docs folder, and we just specify the name of the folder and a slash to indicate that it is a directory. And now if I run git status, we'll see that it no longer shows up. And there we go. We have documentation. All right, any questions on that?
So this thing about like Express hosting, yeah, I'm just amazed. But like, so the Express thing, where did you find that? Is that in the Express doc?
Yeah, you can find this in the Express docs. Yeah, I mean, what this is doing is this is essentially building a router for us that when file names are requested, right, because we're implicitly requesting index.html here, what it's going to do is it's going to go and look inside of this docs directory for a file named index.html and then send that back as the response. And this is something that you could do manually, inside of a router by, using the commands we have in Node to be able to, both look for and read the contents of files. But this is a common enough problem that it is built into Express, where I can just set up a router that will, when requests are made for file names, it will try to find those file names and give back the contents of that files. And so not only are we getting this HTML, we're also getting the associated JavaScript and CSS that comes along with it. So, yeah. So, it's pretty nice. And I know that most of the stuff I'm doing is JavaScript based, but if we have any Java folks in the crowd, apiDoc does also support Java. So you can do the same thing, although I know a lot of Java devs like to use Swagger, which is another doc system. You can find and use whatever system you like for docs. Any other questions with this? All right, well then I want to talk about one last thing real quick, is that let's say this is my build week project, and man, I don't have authentication set up yet. You know, I don't have users and logins and whatnot. So I could create a directory called auth. And then inside of here, I could create a file called auth router. And before I even actually write any JavaScript code, I could write some basic documentation for each one of these endpoints. So I could go into my owner's router, and I'm just going to copy and paste some of this stuff just to avoid some of the busy work and typing it. And so this is going to be a post on the auth login endpoint, and this is going to be login user, and the name of this is going to be named login user, and this is going to be in the auth group. We're going to need to provide a few params. It's going to be username and password, except these are going to be of type strings. Right? Without having written this endpoint, I know what this is going to look like. Writing great descriptions here. And then on success, we'll return a token. It's going to be a string. It's going to be a token, and it is going to be a JSON web token. So then I know, even though I don't have anything to copy and paste in here, I have a response that's going to contain a token, and the example is going to look, let me get rid of that. That's my JSON web token. And so I have not written this yet, but I can write documentation. I can write speculative documentation about this. So I can generate this. And now this is loading. I guess it didn't like having the hash on there. And now I have the documentation for this. Right? And I can also, another thing you can do to be nice to your front-end developers, besides providing them documentation for things that, they will expect to exist, like think about how easy it would be to for me to go through and just write just this part for each one of the endpoints, right? Or just throw the endpoint in here and the route it's going to be on. And you can just like put, a description in here and be like, expects this, give that back. And then as you write it, you can fill it out. We can also write dummy endpoints really easily. So let's const do a router is equal to require express dot router. And then module.exports is going to equal to our router. So I'm going to write a server.post endpoint on login, and it's going to take a rec and a res. And this is going to be my login endpoint, right? Now I'd have to get all my bcrypt stuff in order to generate tokens and all of that, but I can just write a dummy endpoint here that's going to just send back some arbitrary hard-coded nonsense token. And then I can also write my, my sign-up endpoint, in the same way, where it will just say like, message success. And this would be a 201 because we're adding a user. And we could also write some validation in here, like if rec.body and rec.body.username and rec.body.password. Then we want to do this thing. Otherwise, I'm going to do a res.status 400 and say JSON message bad request. And so this isn't hooked into my backend at all. I've written no schema. But I can provide these endpoints with some basic documentation for my front end so they can get going on stuff. So we're not waiting until Thursday for things to get kicking. So now I can write instead of login, I'm just going to replace login with sign up. I have to do it here too. And we'll still need username and password. And on success, we're going to get back a message instead of a JWT. And you could always return a JWT there as well. Then regenerate my docs. Oh, it didn't like that. There we go. And so now I have my docs with my login and my sign-up endpoints that are up there and working, right? Our front end can use these. It doesn't matter what the content of this token is. We just have to make sure it's there. So we could write our dummy middleware if we wanted to, or it's just going to check for that this string exists, and we can keep going. So we can build this API instead of from the model up by starting with some dummy endpoints so that they can get started pulling in data from the API, right? We can have a get endpoint for our widgets return just some hard-coded array that we have before we even have the model working, so that our front end can be successful while we do the work that we need to. So something you can do to be nice for your team. Do we have any questions? Kind of wrapping this up on anything that I did.
This is not important really, but what is the /1.1 for HTTP? Is that a version of HTTP?
Yep, that's the version. HTTP 2 was recently ratified. You don't have to include this. This is just, you can put any text you want in here, but the API docs will, just put it in there. So I can just say this. Technically, this is what the body looks like when you send it back. If we find the raw body of our request, whatnot. How do I get if we look at the raw request, we literally get this string that is going to contain this information, and then all the headers, and then there would be the JSON body right here. So that's part of the request. But we had HTTP 1.1 for a very, very long time, and HTTP 2 is coming out to the web, and it's a lot faster and does some things better and all of that. So, yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah. So how do we distinguish what's interpreted to be a string versus what's like used as variables and like things by the API doc?
You would have to reference it. Essentially these @ things are basically, functions that result in specific formatting. So some of them take arguments, like API param, will take these set of arguments, and API param example accepts, the type and the title arguments, and then just whatever textual content that wants to be in the body. So they have docs for this. Example is a multi-line bit of things. We can also have things like descriptions, and we can also define things for reuse and stuff like that. We can also include header information, right? So for protected endpoints, we'd have this @API header. You just got to read through here, figure out, how to use this. Again, they have very nice docs for this. The last thing I want to show you that I just realized is the apidoc.json file, which is not necessary, but you can just create wrong file. apidoc.json, and this is just going to be some configuration information. And I'm just honestly going to copy and paste the one that I did for my build week, and we'll change up the values in here. But it allows you to specify the name of your project. So this would be, you know, like API docs example project. We can specify the version of our API. This uses semver by default, which is a versioning scheme, short for semantic versioning. And basically, major releases are this first number, and they're generally stable releases. Minor releases are the second number, and then patch releases are the last one. So if you're adding or changing features, you'd release a minor release. If you're just fixing bugs, that would be a patch release. And if you're changing the way your API works fundamentally in a way that breaks, you know, previous use case, then that would be a major version release. I had mine on 0.01 because it's certainly not stable yet, so that also doesn't count. We can have a description in here. And then a title as well. And then we can also specify a base URL for where this project is going to be deployed, so that you know, the endpoints that we're referencing have some place to start out with. So then when we generate our docs, we're going to see that the information from that file got populated in here. So there's that information. We can see the title is the title we set in there as well. And we also now have this URL prefixing the ones that we have here. We have this double slash here because of the way that that was formatted. So let's go and fix that and leave off the trailing slash there. And then regenerate our docs. And there we go. Now we have our nice high quality documentation. All right.
So if we wanted to have the docs in the README, is there any way to like put the hosted file in the README of the repo?
Yeah, so ultimately where this would end up being hosted is at, you know, whatever.heroku.com/whatever endpoint we wanted to put this on. So we could just put this URL inside of our README file. There's no way to embed this content in the README because it's, you know, complicated HTML, CSS, and JS, and you can embed some HTML in the READMEs, but you wouldn't be able to get all this. I don't think. So yeah, you can just put a link to that in there, and it should work. All right.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing this with us. I mean, this was really super insightful.
Yeah, there's lots of cool tools like this. Whenever you have a problem that you're approaching, try Googling it first, because, you know, chances are someone has found a way to solve it that's going to be very helpful. One of the goals of us programming is to only have to solve problems once. So there's lots of great tooling to help us as devs. Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up.
I had a question about deployment,
Yeah.
but I mean, that's not pertaining. Yeah.
Right,
So should I ask now, or?
Why don't you send me a message on that? I want to keep the recording short, and I also have to go eat lunch. So I will see you all tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll go over testing, both because I missed the recitation on it last week, but I do have some helpful hints and tips that will make your tests a bit easier to manage and also a bit faster to run. So I'll see you all tomorrow.